Being a big pro wrestling fan, I was very excited to hear of a film being presented about big figures in pro wrestling, despite the sorrow in its story. And especially when it's from a production company like A24. This channel is obviously dedicated to wrestling, but another big passion of mine that was around even before wrestling is movies. So the combination of my two favorite things made The Iron Claw one of my most anticipated films of the year. With a stacked cast, Chavo Guerrero working on the wrestling choreography and performing a match in one scene, it had me hopeful that it would be a great retelling of some legends in the wrestling business, but at the same time, a deeply sad family story. And I'm glad to say that director Sean Durkin, along with the entire cast and crew, did a great telling of this story. If you're not aware of the true story, The Iron Claw is about the Von Erich family, along with the widely talked about curse that the family had. Father Fritz Von Erich was a wrestling sensation in Texas during the 1960s and had a brief stint in Japan. Then by the time his sons were grown enough for the business, he would eventually have all of his boys step foot in the squared circle as well. With brothers Kevin, Kerry, and David Von Erich being the main attractions at the Dallas Sportatorium and soon nationwide superstars. But eventually led to a drastic downward spiral for the family, with addiction, grief, and multiple deaths. And many could say it was at the fault of Fritz Von Erich himself. Zac Efron gave the performance of his career as Kevin Von Erich. He clearly gave a ton of dedication to this film, both with getting a bigger physique and going to much higher dramatics than we're used to seeing from him. Jeremy Allen White is also great as Kerry. He was the Von Erich with a lot of higher successes, even being a former WWF Intercontinental Champion. But his story also comes with a ton of heartache, and White's execution of that was amazing. Harris Dickinson could be the overall standout performance. He brought a ton of heart, amazing passion, and portraying the talker of the Von Erichs, he really did stand up to the task. Stanley Simons was also a big element to what would make the dramatics work as much as it did. If you do know the family's history, he wasn't the most successful in the ring, but at the same time, he never really did want to be a wrestler. Then the parents, portrayed by Holt McCallany and Maura Tierney, do a great job, with Holt really having to bring the toxic masculinity. And he f***ing brought it. I do want to get into the wrestling aspect of the Iron Claw, because for fellow wrestling fans, I could imagine you'd want to know if the execution is a good tribute to the business. And while wrestling isn't the beneficial factor to the film, the family's overall story is, the wrestling scenes are really damn good. Either the few matches that they show, or a highlighted scene of Kevin Von Erich / Zac Efron failing to cut a promo. And there were a few people in the wrestling business working on the film. Like I mentioned, Chavo Guerrero being the wrestling choreographer for the film. There's also other wrestling legends represented in the film, like Harley Race, Bruiser Brody, the Fabulous Freebirds, and Ric Flair. AEW's Ryan Nemeth also did work for the movie, and AEW World Champion MJF was cast as Lance Von Erich. But sorry to burst your bubble, he's only in it for a few seconds and doesn't have a word of dialogue. But it was really cool to see him in it. When it comes to the adaptation to the story of the Von Erichs, it has great execution, but I think was held back a bit with the pace. And for this portion, I will be telling drastic events that the film does show, along with some other history about the Von Erich family. So if you don't want as much knowledge before watching the film, click to this spot of the video to avoid anything that would spoil the Iron Claw for you. The tragedy with the deaths or suicides in the Von Erich family are stories that have impacted either wrestling fans or anyone who heard about it on the news at the time. Like I've discussed, the film mentions that the family believed they had a curse years before, with the death of Doris and Fritz Von Erich's first son Jack when he was only 7 years old. And the film focused on how, especially Kevin, always feared that the curse would come back to haunt him or the ones closest to him. And the fears started to become a reality, and it started with the tragic death of David Von Erich in 1984 while he was wrestling in Japan. The film showed David's addiction to steroids and the overall pressure from either the business or his father really getting to him. I mentioned earlier that Stanley Simons' performance was a benefit to what made some of the dramatics work, and Mike Von Erich's story is very heartbreaking. The film exploited a true passion of Mike's, which was to be a musician. But he did step in the ring after David's death, getting injured very easily and then tragically suffering from toxic shock syndrome. And Fritz was still saying he would get back in the ring eventually. The disappointment Mike felt that he brought to the family led to him committing suicide in 1987 at only 23 years old. Then Kerry's story had a bit of a longer process. Before wrestling, he was wanting to be a part of the Olympics. Then, in the midst of his biggest successes in wrestling, he got his foot amputated after a motorcycle accident, while he already had very bad addictions to drugs and alcohol. He did continue to wrestle, but people like Ric Flair have said that Kerry would have been at a much higher level if it wasn't for his addictions. And that addiction, depression, and a recent divorce that isn't really acknowledged in the film sadly led to Kerry's suicide in 1993. And the consistent heartbreak after heartbreak has some terrific execution in the film, especially showing how it affected Kevin, Doris, and Kevin's wife Pam, who was played very well by Lily James, which I forgot to mention. And it does make sense with it following Kevin mainly, since he's the only Von Erich brother still alive, he's the only one that can continue telling the story. But so much of their tragedy had to be paced at around an hour, since that's around the time in the film when David's death happens. Which does make the film feel kind of rushed, especially if you're aware of the Von Erichs' history, to the point where they had to cut out some of that history. The youngest son of the family, Chris Von Erich, also stepped in the ring, but suffered from asthma and weaker bones to the point where he couldn't compete in the ring. And it's sadder because plenty people close to them or members of the family acknowledge that Chris was probably the most passionate for professional wrestling out of all of the siblings. And he also sadly committed suicide at the age of 21, 4 years after Mike's and 2 years before Kerry's. But Chris isn't a part of the film at all. Chavo Guerrero said he did ask Sean Durkin about it, and he didn't add Chris into the story because there was already too much tragedy. And after seeing the film, I do more so understand why they did it, but I think this story could have used a huge extension. It honestly would have worked a lot better as a miniseries, so you could get more time to feel the grief and get more of a deep dive into what these brothers were really going through. And even more so, being able to dive deep into Fritz and the control he had over his boy's life. They mentioned his toxic parenting and how he would rank his kids, but his bitterness toward the wrestling business and that being passed down to all sons could have been exploited way more. Because stuff like him taking parts of their payment for any wrestling shows is only mentioned in a couple of lines, but doesn't signify how that was Fritz's way to always have his sons depend on him. And he was also a man that was a bit too dedicated to the world of wrestling and not reality, making plenty of gross tactics like using the real death of wrestler Gino Hernandez for a story, and what might be the worst, faking a heart attack on a Christmas show for WCCW, while they were already doing tributes to David at that show. Many say it was the moment that ruined his company. The film mainly does follow the family, so I do see why they didn't show wrestling moments like that, but they definitely could have antagonized Fritz more than they did. But it brings back to my opinion of this story having a miniseries, or maybe even a documentary, because there is so much more to this family story that I think is worth looking into despite the heartache that it will bring. But I have heard that there was also an extended cut of this film that critics saw, where apparently MJF got more screen time. So I would be interested in seeing that cut if it could be added to the 4K or Blu-ray. So while I don't think that Iron Claw was a perfect film since the pace could have had a bit more dedication to it, with everything they showed, it's still a fantastic display of either some of the greatest wrestlers in the business, the famously titled Curse of the Von Erichs, or the overall bond that these brothers had. The buildup of pressure and destroyed relationships also gave me vibes of Foxcatcher, which is another great wrestling film. Collegiate wrestling, but still wrestling. The chemistry shined the entire time with this cast, and the clear passion overall showed by the crew still did this story justice. While I explain my issues with the film, I do continue to get more appreciation for it the more I think about it. It could be a little biased since I'm a big wrestling fan, and I was glad to see a story of the business being exploited on the big screen, despite it being one that really punches you in the gut. But overall, I would say The Iron Claw is a strong 4 out of 5, and it's definitely worth checking out in theaters when it's released next week. So that was my review for The Iron Claw. Thank you so much for watching this video, and please make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell for notifications, and duke out your opinions below in the comments.